In Boone Ridge, Montana, Ethan Ward, a cocky city writer, was about to learn why locals never mocked the mountain woman. What started as a simple hunting trip took a chilling turn when they met Clara Boone, the reclusive tracker everyone whispered about. For 20 years, she'd survived the wild, known for finding anyone, living or dead. When they stumbled upon a wounded elk on her land, Ethan laughed, until Clara's eyes froze him cold. That moment turned arrogance into fear. Boone Ridge would never forget the mountain woman's warning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm moved in faster than anyone expected. By the time Sheriff Hank Larson's team had loaded their trucks and pushed up toward Boone Ridge, fat, wet flakes were already filling the air like falling ash. The wipers struggled against it. The headlights carved pale tunnels through the white darkness. Ethan Ward sat in the back seat of the sheriff's truck beside Wade Kavanaugh, the wiry hunter from the store. The man smelled faintly of gun oil and pine tar. Every few minutes, Wade would reach up to adjust the dial on the old CB radio, trying to catch fragments of chatter from the other search groups. "Lost signal past the mill road," he muttered. "Ain't no use past there anyhow. Ridge'll block everything." Ethan, notebook open on his lap, scribbled furiously despite the jostling of the truck. He wrote down everything, the hiss of static, the way Hank gripped the steering wheel like it owed him something, the haunted look Lauren Grayson had worn as they left her behind at the store. It was good material, he told himself. A human story about small-town fear, superstition, and the endurance of family. Maybe even a book someday. He told himself that because it was easier than admitting the truth. He was scared, too. The road narrowed, turning into a winding stretch that hugged the mountain's shoulder. The world beyond the glass disappeared into gray. "Used to be logging country," Wade said, breaking the silence. "Back in the 50s, this ridge fed half the mills in Montana. When the trees dried up, so did the people. Clara Boone's daddy was the last foreman up here before he didn't come back." Ethan looked up. "Boone," he repeated. "That's where the ridge gets its name?" Wade nodded. "Her family built a cabin up near the old Firewatch Road. After her daddy died, her mama raised her up there. No electricity, no school. Folks say Clara learned to track before she could write her name." Hank grunted. "And she stayed there after her mom passed. Won't come down unless she has to." Ethan's pen hesitated. "Why not?" Wade shifted uncomfortably. "Some say she don't like people. Others say people don't like her. But every time a hiker goes missing or a storm takes someone off the trail, it's her they call. She's brought back more bodies than the county rescue ever did." "Bodies?" "Sometimes alive," Wade added quietly. "Mostly not." The words hung heavy between them. Hank slowed the truck to a crawl as they reached a narrow bridge spanning a frozen creek. Beyond it, the road vanished into deep forest. He turned off the engine and let the headlights cut into the snow for a moment longer before killing them. "This is where we split," Hank said. "Search teams cover from here to the lower ridge. If we don't find tracks by midnight, we regroup." Ethan looked out at the darkness, then back at Hank. "And if you don't find him by then?" Hank's expression didn't change. "Then I'll do what I said. Go to her," Ethan finished quietly. The sheriff's silence was confirmation enough. The search stretched long into the night. The snow thickened, swallowing the men's shouts and the flicker of their flashlights. The storm made the world small. Just the crunch of boots, the occasional bark of Hank's radio, and the relentless wind screaming down from the higher ridge. Ethan stayed close to Wade. His city shoes quickly soaked through, despite the borrowed snow pants. Every tree began to look the same. Every shadow felt like it moved. "See any sign?" He asked for what felt like the 100th time. Wade crouched, brushing snow away from a faint indentation. "Could be deer," he said. "Could be boy-sized, too. Hard to tell in this mess." They followed the faint trail for another 100 yards before it vanished entirely into a tangle of firs and shadow. "Damn it," Wade muttered. "Storm's burying everything." Ethan looked up the slope, where a dark outline loomed, a mountain so close it seemed to swallow the sky. "How far up does Boone Ridge go?" Farther than sense does, Wade replied grimly. You go too high, you start hearing things. The wind sounds like people talking. Some say it's the ridge calling you back down before it takes you. Ethan gave a nervous chuckle. You sound like you believe that. The older man's eyes glinted beneath the brim of his hat. I don't believe in ghosts, city boy, but I believe in what this mountain does to people. By midnight, they regrouped at the trucks. No sign of Tyler Grayson. No tracks worth following. Hank stood in the falling snow, staring up toward the dark peak beyond the timberline. His jaw worked as he weighed something heavy. Ethan could see the decision forming before Hank even spoke. Wade, the sheriff said. You take the others back down. Wake Lauren. Tell her we're not giving up. And you? I'm going up, Wade's eyes widened. Hank, don't try to talk me out of it. You know as well as I do. She's the only chance that boy's got. Ethan stepped forward, breath fogging. Then I'm coming with you. Hank turned sharply. You're not. Look, I've come this far, Ethan insisted. If this Clara woman really is some kind of legend, I want to see it. Hell, maybe I can help. Hank sighed long and low. You'll just slow me down. Then I'll stay out of your way. Ethan met his gaze unflinching. But I'm not turning back. For a long moment the sheriff said nothing. Then, muttering something under his breath, he tossed Ethan a spare flashlight. Stay close. And if I tell you to stop, you stop. Ethan nodded. The sheriff adjusted his hat, turned toward the ridge, and said quietly, All right then, let's go wake the mountain woman. They climbed for nearly 2 hours. The trail narrowed to little more than a deer path, winding between skeletal pines and half-buried boulders. The snow reached their knees in places. The wind screamed like a thing alive. Ethan's lungs burned. His fingers ached. Each breath turned to frost in the beam of his flashlight. The forest felt ancient, untouched, almost resentful of their presence. Finally, they reached a ridge overlook. Below them, the valley was a swirling white ocean. Above, the dark outline of a cabin appeared through the snow, a lonely shape against the wild expanse. That's her place, Hank said. Ethan followed him up the last stretch. The cabin was smaller than he expected, built of dark logs. Its windows shuttered against the storm. Animal pelts hung from a covered porch, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifted from a stone chimney. Hank hesitated before knocking. He rubbed his hands together, the way a man does before touching something sacred or dangerous. He knocked 3 times. At first, nothing, just the wind. Then a sound from inside, soft footsteps, slow and deliberate. The door opened a few inches, revealing the glint of a rifle barrel. Who's there? The voice was low, roughened by cold air and solitude. It's Hank Larson, the sheriff called. Got someone missing down in the valley. Need your help. A pause. Then the door opened wider. The woman who stood before them looked carved from the same wood as the cabin itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy fur coat. Her hair was long and dark, streaked with gray, and her eyes, clear, piercing blue, held the kind of calm that comes from surviving too much. Sheriff, she said, lowering the rifle but not her guard. Thought you swore you'd never set foot up here again. I did, Hank admitted. But it's Lauren's boy, Tyler. Clara Boone's expression softened just slightly. How long? Since sundown. She nodded once, brisk. You waited too long. Storm came fast, he said. We did what we could. Her gaze shifted to Ethan, lingering a moment. And who's the city man? Ethan Ward, he said, stepping forward. Writer, her brow arched. Writer, huh? Don't have much use for those up here? I get that a lot. Something in his tone, half self-deprecating, half defiant, made her study him a moment longer before she turned back to Hank. Get inside before you freeze solid. The cabin's interior was warm, lit by the steady glow of a wood stove. Animal skulls and maps lined the walls. A single lantern hung over a table covered in gear, knives, ropes, and a weathered compass older than any of them. Ethan stood near the fire, rubbing his hands while his eyes wandered. The place felt both primitive and precise, like a hunter's chapel. Clara moved with quiet efficiency, packing a rucksack with supplies. Where was he last seen? By the river, Hank replied. Near the old traps, she nodded. If he followed the river north, the current could have thrown his scent off. Wolves are hungry this time of year. Ethan flinched at the casual mention. You think he's... Clara met his eyes. I think he's out there, and if we don't move, we'll be too late. She threw on a heavy cloak and slung her pack over her shoulder. Hank followed suit. Ethan hesitated. Wait, you're going out now? In this? Clara's voice was steady. The mountain doesn't wait for daylight. Hank looked at Ethan. You can stay here if you want. Stove's warm. Won't think less of you. But Ethan shook his head. I came to see the truth behind the legend. Guess this is it. A flicker of something, respect maybe, crossed Clara's expression. Then stay close, city man, and don't touch what you don't understand. The snow was deeper now, the storm thicker. Yet Clara moved through it as though it were smoke, her steps sure and silent. Ethan stumbled behind her, gasping for breath. Hank trailed close, his flashlight catching fleeting glimpses of tracks, faint depressions half swallowed by snow. Small boots, Clara murmured. He passed this way less than 4 hours ago, Ethan blinked. You can tell that from a footprint? She didn't answer, just kept moving. The forest grew darker as they climbed. The storm eased for a moment, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt wrong. Then faintly a sound, distant, echoing through the trees. A shout. Tyler? Hank called, but the wind swallowed the name. Clara raised a hand. Quiet. They waited. The sound came again, closer this time. A thin, panicked cry. Over there, she said, already moving toward it. They followed her through a thicket until the trees broke open into a small clearing. There, half buried in snow, was a boy, maybe 12, trembling, his face pale and eyes wide. Tyler! Hank rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside him. The boy blinked up weakly. Sheriff, I lost the trail. You're safe now, son? Hank said, wrapping him in his coat. But Clara was scanning the tree line, eyes narrowed. No, she murmured. Not safe yet. Ethan turned, heart pounding. What do you mean? A sound answered for her, a low growl from the darkness. Then another. Wolves. Hank drew his sidearm, flashlight sweeping the shadows. Several pairs of eyes glowed back, yellow and unblinking. Back up slow, Clara said, pulling a hunting knife from her belt. Don't run. They'll chase. Ethan swallowed hard. There's more than one. 7, she said without hesitation. Maybe 8. Young ones, hungry. The nearest wolf stepped into the light, its breath steaming, its fur bristling silver gray. It snarled. Clara moved like lightning. She stepped forward, knife low, voice rising in a sharp, guttural shout that echoed through the clearing, a sound that wasn't quite human, something primal and commanding. The wolves flinched, hesitating. Hank used the moment to fire a warning shot into the air. The echo cracked through the night. The pack scattered, vanishing into the trees. Silence fell again, broken only by Tyler's sobs and the wind's low moan. Ethan stood frozen, staring at Clara. The firelight from Hank's lantern flickered across her face, revealing calm where there should have been fear. What the hell was that? He breathed. Clara wiped the blade clean on the snow. Just knowing how to speak to the mountain's children. Ethan shook his head slowly. You're not like anyone I've ever met. She gave a faint, humorless smile. That's the point. They made it back to the cabin before dawn. The storm was breaking, streaks of grey light pushing through the clouds. Clara built a fire while Hank wrapped Tyler in blankets. Ethan sat near the stove, notebook forgotten on his lap. He finally understood what the locals meant. The reverence, the fear. Clara Boone wasn't just a woman. She was the ridge itself, unyielding, wild, and impossible to ignore. When Hank finished calling the valley to report the boy's rescue, he turned to her. You saved his life, again, Clara shrugged. You did the right thing coming to me. He nodded slowly. Still, it cost you, didn't it? Her eyes flickered toward the window, where the first light touched the snow. The mountain always takes something in return, Ethan frowned. What does that mean? She didn't answer, but later, when they left the ridge and Ethan looked back one last time, he saw her standing on the porch, alone against the endless white, watching them go with a look that wasn't sorrow, but something deeper. A promise, or maybe a warning, and though he didn't yet know it, this wouldn't be the last time Ethan Ward saw Clara Boone, because Boone Ridge had a way of keeping the people it chose. When morning broke over Boone Ridge, it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like truce. The storm had eased, leaving behind a brittle silence that clung to everything. Trees bowed under the weight of snow. Smoke drifted thin and grey from Clara Boone's chimney. Curling into a pale sky the colour of old bone, Ethan Ward stood by the window, watching as Sheriff Hank Larson loaded the boy, Tyler, into the truck below. The kid was wrapped tight in blankets, asleep in his mother's arms. Lauren Grayson was crying, not the loud, desperate kind, but quiet tears that froze before they fell. Ethan wasn't supposed to see this. He wasn't part of this town, or this grief, or the strange mythology wrapped around that woman, standing silently on the porch. And yet, something in him wouldn't let go of what he'd witnessed last night. The way she'd faced those wolves. The way the storm itself seemed to bend around her presence. She looked out over the valley now, unmoving, her breath misting the air. When she finally turned, her eyes caught his. For a moment it felt like she could see through him, like she knew exactly what kind of man he was. "Storm's done," she said simply. "You heading back with them?" Ethan hesitated. "I thought I might stay a while." "Writers," she muttered, not unkindly. "Always digging where it hurts." He smiled faintly. "That's where the stories live." Clara studied him for a long moment. "You're not from here. The mountain doesn't owe you anything. Don't make it notice you." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but something in her voice made the back of his neck prickle. He'd come to Boone Ridge, looking for an ending to his writer's block, some rural color, a bit of drama to wrap into a book. But now it felt like he'd stepped into someone else's story, one that didn't want him there. Still, Ethan Ward had never been the kind to turn away from a mystery. Back in town, Boone Ridge returned to its quiet routines. The diner opened late that morning. The regulars sat in their usual spots, steam rising from mugs that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and comfort. But the atmosphere had changed. Hushed, reverent, uneasy. Word of the boy's rescue had spread faster than the thaw. Everyone knew who had found him. Everyone knew what it had cost. Lauren Grayson came in that afternoon, pale but composed. She thanked everyone, hugged Hank, and then, when she saw Ethan at the counter, gave him a tight smile. "You were there, weren't you?" He nodded. "Yeah, Clara found him." Lauren's gaze dropped to the floor. "Of course she did. You sound sad," Ethan said gently. "Your boy's safe." Lauren's fingers tightened around her cup. "In Boone Ridge, nothing comes free. Clara knows that better than anyone." Ethan frowned. "You mean what she said, that the mountain always takes something in return?" Lauren didn't answer. She just looked out the frosted window, where the ridge loomed distant and white. "Ask her," she murmured, "if you're brave enough." That night, Ethan sat in his rented cabin, with the heat turned up and his laptop open, but the blinking cursor mocked him. He couldn't write. Not about the boy, not about the storm, not yet. Instead, he opened a search tab and typed in Clara Boone, Montana. The results were thin. An old newspaper clipping from 1999, local girl rescues missing hiker during blizzard. Another from 2007, Boone Ridge tracker finds bodies of lost hunters. Then a darker one, Boone Ridge tragedy, 3 die in fire. One survivor, he clicked it. The article was short, sparse facts. A cabin fire high on the ridge. Victims, Edward Boone, Marjorie Boone, and infant son, Samuel. Survivor, Clara Boone, age 17. Cause of fire undetermined. Ethan leaned back, the flicker of his screen lighting the doubt in his eyes. So, that was it. That's why she lived alone. That's why the town spoke her name like a prayer and a curse. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere far off a coyote cried, long, mournful. It sounded almost human. The next morning, Ethan packed a thermos and drove back up toward the ridge. Hank's warning echoed in his head. The mountain doesn't wait for daylight. The road was half-cleared but treacherous. His SUV fishtailed twice before he reached the Frozen Creek Bridge. He parked there and walked the rest of the way on foot, boots crunching through crusted snow. Clara Boone was outside, chopping wood. Each swing of her axe was measured, powerful, almost meditative. She looked up when she heard him approach, Didn't think I'd see you again so soon, she said. I had questions, figures. She set the axe against a stump and wiped her hands on her coat. City men always want reasons. Out here things just are, Ethan hesitated. I read about the fire. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at the line of trees, the pale smoke rising behind them. Then you know enough, she said finally. I know what the paper said, Ethan pressed. Not what really happened. Clara's jaw tightened. What difference would it make to you? I don't know, he admitted. Maybe none. But people talk about you like you're half ghost, half savior. Don't you want the truth out there? Her eyes flashed a cold blue blaze. The truth doesn't save anyone. It just burns slower, Ethan swallowed. Your parents were good people, she cut in sharply. The ridge wasn't kind to them. He waited. The silence between them thickened, heavy with things unsaid. Finally, she sighed and motioned toward the cabin. If you're going to keep asking questions, you might as well do it by the fire. Inside, the heat from the stove filled the small space. The smell of pine resin and smoke clung to everything. Clara poured coffee from an old tin pot into 2 mismatched mugs. My father was the foreman for the Boone Logging Company, she said at last. He loved this mountain, said it talked to him, not in words, but in signs. My mother used to laugh about it. She looked down at her hands. Then one winter the signs stopped making sense. Ethan leaned forward. The fire? Clara nodded slowly. We'd had a bad storm. Dad went up to check the logging camp. He didn't come back that night. Ma went after him with Samuel in her arms. I followed her tracks up to the tree line. Her voice dropped lower. I found her hours later. The cabin was burning. Wolves howling. I dragged her out, but she was already gone. She looked into the flames, eyes distant. When the sheriff came, there was nothing left but ashes and bones. They said it was an accident. I knew better. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, Ethan hesitated. What do you mean? Clara's gaze lifted, calm but unyielding. This ridge doesn't forgive trespass. It remembers everything. Her words hung in the air, part warning, part confession. Ethan's journalist instinct wanted to push further, to dig into whatever she wasn't saying. But something in her expression made him stop. There was grief there, yes, but also guilt. The kind that never quite leaves. You ever think of leaving? He asked quietly. I tried, she said simply. Once made it all the way to Missoula. Thought I could start over. But the day I left, a hunter vanished near the ridge. They found him 3 weeks later, half buried in snow. Folks said the mountain got angry I'd gone. She gave a bitter smile. So I came back. Seemed simpler to stay where the ghosts already knew my name. Ethan stayed until the light began to fade. When he finally left, he glanced back to see her standing by the tree line, motionless, almost blending into the landscape. On the drive down, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, not out of suspicion, but out of something older, heavier. As if the ridge itself used her eyes to see, a week later Boone Ridge began to thaw. The river ice cracked. The snow slumped into dirty slush, and for the first time in months, sunlight reached the valley floor. But the town didn't warm with it. Something had shifted, a tension no one could name. Another child went missing. This time it was a teenager. Cody Phelps, 17, last seen near the old Firewatch Road. His friends said he'd gone up there on a dare, bragging he could make it to the mountain woman's cabin and back before dark. He didn't. Hank Larson called a search that same night. Ethan was already at the station when the news broke. The sheriff didn't even need to say it. Everyone knew what had to happen next. Lauren Grayson said it first. You'll call her again, won't you? Hank rubbed a hand over his face. I don't have a choice. You never do, Lauren murmured. Ethan watched the exchange quietly. Something in his chest twisted, a blend of dread and curiosity. He wanted to believe what happened to Tyler was luck, not legend. But the look in Hank's eyes said otherwise. Can I come? Ethan asked. Hank shot him a tired look. Didn't learn your lesson the first time? Maybe I did, Ethan said. That's why I need to see the second one. They reached Clara's cabin after sundown. The air was colder again, the sky bruised with another storm on the horizon. She was already waiting outside, lantern in hand. I heard, she said before Hank even spoke. Cody Phelps, he nodded. Last seen near the Firewatch Road. Clara exhaled slowly. That's bad ground. What do you mean? Her gaze shifted toward the higher ridge. That's where the old camp used to be. The one my father ran. Ethan's pulse quickened. Where the fire happened? She gave a single nod. That place has a memory. It doesn't like visitors. Hank's voice hardened. We're not asking for superstition, Clara. Just help us find the boy. You don't understand, she said quietly. Every time I go up there, it gets worse. The mountain remembers what it took, and it wants more. The wind gusted through the trees then, scattering snow like ash. It sounded eerily like laughter. Hank adjusted his hat. We go at dawn. With or without you. Clara's jaw worked, torn between reason and instinct. Then she sighed. Fine, but when we find what's left of him, don't say I didn't warn you. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire in the cabin's guest cot, listening to the wind drag its icy fingers across the roof. Somewhere deep in the woods, an owl cried. 3 short notes, sharp and deliberate. Then silence. He pulled out his notebook and began to write. She's not afraid of death, he scrawled. She's afraid of remembering it. He didn't know where that thought came from, but it felt right. Outside, a faint glow flickered among the trees. Too steady to be moonlight. A campfire? A lantern? He moved to the window, heart racing, but when he looked again, it was gone. Only the darkness remained, and somewhere within it, the whisper of the ridge, soft, almost human. It remembers. The storm had rolled in like a living thing. Wind clawed at the eaves of the cabins. Snow spiraled thick and relentless, and the mountains that usually framed Boone Ridge disappeared behind a curtain of white. By dawn, the search had failed. No tracks, no trail, nothing but the frozen river and the whisper of trees bending under the weight of the storm. Ethan hadn't slept. He sat in the corner of the diner, the same seat he'd taken the night before, his notebook half filled with observations that now felt hollow. The coffee in front of him had long gone cold. Lauren sat across the room, pale and silent, her hands wrapped tightly around her husband's. Rick looked broken, his eyes unfocused and raw from crying. Hank Larson stepped through the door just after sunrise, brushing snow off his coat. The look on his face told everyone before he said a word. Nothing. Not a trace of the boy. Lauren rose slowly, her voice hoarse. Hank, please. The sheriff met her eyes for a long moment, then nodded once. Get your coat, he said quietly. We're going. Ethan blinked, confused. Going where? Hank didn't answer. He looked toward Wade Kavanaugh, who was nursing a flask at the counter. You're coming too. Wade hesitated, but the sheriff's tone left no room for argument. Ain't seen her since last winter, Wade muttered, standing. She won't like this. She doesn't have to like it, Hank said grimly. She just has to help. Lauren moved to follow them, but Hank stopped her at the door. You stay here. If she's coming, she'll need space. She doesn't do well with crowds. Lauren's eyes glistened. Just bring my boy home. Ethan stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder. You'll need a record of this, he said, voice steady, despite the tremor in his gut. If this woman's the legend you say she is, I want to see it. Hank turned to him. You don't want to see her. Trust me. But Ethan was already zipping up his jacket. I didn't come all the way to Montana to write about pancakes and elk sightings. The sheriff sighed, jaw tight. Fine, you stay quiet. You do exactly what I say. They left Boone Ridge in a pair of trucks that struggled against the rising drifts. The tires groaned over snow that hadn't been plowed in years. As they climbed higher, the landscape transformed from rough pine forest to jagged wilderness, ancient firs standing like sentinels, snow swallowing everything beneath them. Wade's truck led the way, headlights cutting through the white void. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. I don't like this, he muttered. She told us last time not to come back. She'll come, Hank said from the passenger seat. She always does when it's about a child. Ethan leaned forward from the back seat. You said she's a tracker. Military, native ranger? What's her story? Neither man spoke. Come on, Ethan pressed. You can't just drop a myth on me and say nothing. Finally, Wade exhaled. She's Clara Boone, used to be married to Sam Boone, the man this town was named after. He was a trapper, guide, and one of the best hunters this side of the divide. They say Clara was even better. She could follow a trail 3 days old through fresh snowfall. Ethan raised a brow.
So what happened?
She lost a daughter, Hank said quietly. 15 years ago. Kid went missing in a blizzard like this one. Half the town searched for a week. Never found her. And after that, she stayed, Wade said. Up in the ridge. Built a cabin on her own. Folks tried to bring her back down, but she said she was done with people. Only time she shows herself now is when someone's lost. Ethan scribbled notes furiously, his curiosity flaring. So she's like, what, a hermit hero? Boone Ridge's ghost rescuer. Call her what you want, Hank muttered. Just don't laugh when you meet her. They drove another hour before the trucks could go no farther. The snow was waist-deep, and the air cut like shards of glass. They continued on foot, the only sound the crunch of boots and the moaning wind through the trees. Ethan's lungs burned. He wasn't built for mountain air or bitter cold, but the others pressed on, determined. Finally, as the ridge opened into a small clearing, Wade raised a hand. There, he said, pointing. Through the curtain of falling snow, a small cabin appeared, half buried under white, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked as though it had grown from the mountain itself. They approached, slowly. Hank lifted his gloved hand and knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a voice from within, steady, low, and cold as the wind itself. I told you not to come here again. Ethan felt his heart skip. The door creaked open, revealing a woman wrapped in layers of deer skin and wool, her hair streaked with grey and falling in thick braids. Her eyes were sharp, pale as glacier ice. A rifle hung casually over her shoulder. Morning, Clara, Hank said, removing his hat. We've got a boy missing. Tyler Grayson. Clara Boone's gaze flicked from Hank to Wade, then to Ethan. And who's this? Writer, Hank said shortly. Doesn't know better yet? Ethan smiled, offering a gloved hand. Ethan Ward, big fan of legends. Clara didn't take his hand. Legends die alone, she said flatly, stepping back to let them in. The cabin was warm but sparse, no electricity, just firelight, and the faint scent of pine tar. Animal pelts hung along the walls, maps covered the table, and rows of handmade tools lined the shelves. Ethan noticed a small wooden carving of a young girl near the hearth, the details worn smooth by years of handling. Where? Clara asked without sitting. Up by the river bend, Hank said. He went out before sundown yesterday. Never came back. Clara closed her eyes, as though seeing the terrain unfold behind her lids. River's under 3 feet of ice by now, she murmured. Storm's thick, but if he went north, he'll have found shelter under the shale bluff. She grabbed her pack from the wall, slung the rifle across her back, and reached for a fur-lined hood. We leave now, Ethan blinked. Wait, you're just going out there. No plan, no gear check. Clara looked at him, and for a second Ethan felt smaller than he ever had. Plans don't find people, she said. Instinct does. Wade swallowed hard. You sure you're ready for this again, Clara? You don't owe us. Her expression didn't change. I don't do it for you. The trek back into the storm was brutal. The wind screamed through the trees, the snow blinding. But Clara moved like she was part of the mountain, silent, fluid, every step sure. She led them down narrow ravines, across frozen streams, and through forests that swallowed sound. Ethan struggled to keep up, falling behind often. How the hell does she even see where she's going? He shouted over the wind. She doesn't see, Hank said. She feels. Every so often Clara would stop, crouch, and touch the snow. Her bare fingertips brushed the surface, then she'd turn, adjusting their direction slightly. Ethan finally asked, What are you looking for? Tracks? Not anymore, she said. The snow erased those. I'm looking for the shape the land makes when something's missing. Hours passed. The storm began to thin, though the cold remained bitter. Then, without warning, Clara stopped dead. She knelt beside a fallen log, brushing snow away with her hands. Beneath it, small boot prints. Fresh ones. Ethan's pulse quickened. He's alive? Hank asked. Clara studied the prints. He was moving slow, dragging his left foot. Her expression darkened. He's hurt. She rose and turned north, moving faster now. The others followed, hearts pounding. The forest thinned, revealing a rocky slope. Halfway up, a cave yawned darkly between the stones. Smoke curled faintly from within. Clara raised a hand for silence, motioning for them to stay back. She crept forward, rifle ready. Ethan's breath caught as she disappeared into the shadows. Moments later, her voice echoed from within. "It's him!" They rushed inside. Tyler Grayson sat slumped against the wall, his leg twisted awkwardly, eyes half open. Clara was kneeling beside him, wrapping her coat around his shoulders. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, voice warmer than before. "You did good staying put. You're safe now." Tyler blinked weakly. "Mom? She's waiting for you," Clara said. Hank knelt beside them, relief flooding his face. "We'll get you home, son." Ethan felt something twist in his chest as he watched Clara work, efficient, tender, haunted. He opened his notebook but found himself unable to write. There was something sacred in that moment, something that didn't belong to words. They carried Tyler down the ridge on a makeshift sled, guided by Clara's unerring sense of direction. When they reached the trucks, the storm had broken entirely, the sky a pale blue over endless white. As they loaded the boy inside, Hank turned to Clara. "You saved him. Again." Clara didn't respond. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, toward the peaks, still shrouded in cloud. "The mountain keeps what it wants," she said finally. "This time it let him go." Ethan stepped closer. "You knew he was alive before we even found him, didn't you?" Clara's eyes flicked toward him. "Sometimes the wind carries voices," she said quietly. "You just have to know how to listen." Before Ethan could ask more, she turned away, heading back toward her cabin without another word. He watched her until she vanished into the white expanse, then turned to Hank. "Why does she live like that? Alone, cut off." Hank sighed, starting the engine. "Because 15 years ago, when she lost her little girl, she was the one who found her body." Ethan froze. "What?" "She tracked her for 6 days through the same ridge we just crossed. Found her frozen in a ravine." Hank's voice was low, weighted with grief that wasn't his. "Buried her herself up there. Never left since." Ethan stared out the window as the truck rumbled down the mountain. Snow swirling in the distance where Clara Boone had disappeared. He'd come to Boone Ridge looking for a story, a myth, a mystery, something to fill pages. But what he found was a woman who didn't just live in the mountains. She was the mountain. And some legends, he realized, weren't meant to be written. They were meant to be remembered. Boone Ridge was quiet again, too quiet. The kind of quiet that settled after the storm had taken what it wanted and given back what it chose. The townsfolk went about their routines slower than usual, speaking softer, as if afraid the mountain could still hear. Tyler Grayson was home, his leg bound in a cast, his mother hovering nearby like she might lose him again if she blinked too long. The boy barely remembered what happened, only that the snow was heavy, his foot slipped near the riverbank, and he crawled until the world turned white. Then a woman's voice in the storm, telling him to stay awake. When Ethan Ward came to check on them, Lauren met him at the porch. She looked exhausted but grateful. "You were there," she said quietly. "You saw what she did," Ethan nodded. "She saved him." Lauren's eyes drifted toward the mountains. "She's done it before. Too many times. And every time she goes a little further away when it's over." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "She carries the ones she couldn't save," Lauren whispered. "And the more she carries, the heavier she becomes." Ethan didn't answer. He'd been thinking about Clara Boone since the rescue, the way she'd vanished into the storm, the look in her eyes when she'd found the boy. It wasn't heroism, it was guilt. He'd come to Boone Ridge for a story, and now he had one. But for the first time in his career, Ethan wasn't sure if he had the right to tell it. 2 days later, the town gathered at Hank's office. The storm had passed, but a new problem had risen in its wake. A hunter was missing. Wade Kavanaugh hadn't come back from checking his trapline on the West Ridge. His truck was found abandoned near the timberline, door open, rifle missing. "Probably slipped," one man muttered. "Wade doesn't slip," Hank said flatly. "Not up there." Not on ground he's walked his whole life. Lauren, standing nearby, paled. You think it's the same storm trail? Hank shook his head. Storm's over. This ain't weather. This is something else. Ethan leaned forward, notebook ready. You're saying foul play? Hank's gaze hardened. I'm saying Boone Ridge doesn't lose 2 men in the same week unless something's wrong with the mountain. A chill slid down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. That night, Ethan returned to his cabin and began to write. The words came fast, faster than he could control them. Boone Ridge, a town haunted by silence and a woman who speaks the language of storms. Clara Boone, the tracker, the recluse, the ghost of her own legend. He wrote about the way she moved through the wilderness like she belonged to it. About how every time someone was lost, they called her name like a prayer. About the way people's voices changed when they said it. But when he reached the part about her daughter, he stopped. The image of Clara kneeling in the snow, brushing frost from her child's still face, played in his mind. He couldn't write that. It felt wrong, like prying open a wound just to see if it still bled. He set the pen down, stood, and looked out the window. The moon hung pale over the ridge, lighting the world in silver. Somewhere up there he knew she was watching the forest breathe, and maybe, just maybe, she knew he was watching back. The next morning, the sheriff's truck pulled into his drive. Ward, Hank said, stepping out. You're coming with me, Ethan blinked. What for? Wade's still missing, and Clara sent word. Ethan's heart kicked. She sent word how? Hank handed him a folded scrap of paper. On it, in uneven handwriting, tracks west of Miller's Bluff. Come before the snow covers them. Below it, a single initial. See, they drove fast. The sky was grey, heavy with another promise of snow. As they reached the bluff, Clara was already there, kneeling in the drifts, studying the ground. She didn't look up when they approached. He wasn't alone, she said. Hank crouched beside her. You found his tracks? Yes, 2 sets. His and someone else's. He was being followed. Ethan felt a cold prickle crawl up his neck. Followed by who? Clara didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked toward the tree line, narrow and intent. Whoever it was knew the land, knew how to move quiet. She rose, brushed snow from her gloves, and pointed north. They went that way. Toward Devil's Hollow, Hank swore softly. Nobody goes up there anymore. Ethan glanced between them. Why not? Because it's cursed, Hank said flatly. Old mine collapsed up there in the 70s. Killed 12 men. The ground still shifts. Clara's expression darkened. The mountain keeps its dead close. They followed her into the woods, deeper than before. The pines closed in overhead, thick and endless. The air grew colder, heavier. After an hour they found the first sign, Wade's hunting cap half buried in snow. Clara picked it up, turning it over in her hands. There was a dark smear along the brim. Blood. Hank's face hardened. He's hurt, Clara nodded. But he's moving. The trail's fresh. Ethan trailed behind, scribbling notes between gasps of breath. His fingers ached from the cold, but he couldn't stop writing. Every step felt like a step deeper into a story that might never let him go. The trail led them to a narrow gorge. At its base, they found footprints ending abruptly at the edge of a frozen stream. No sign of struggle. No body. He didn't fall, Clara murmured, scanning the ice. He was taken, Ethan frowned. Taken by who? Clara knelt, pressing her hand to the surface. The ice groaned under her touch. Not who, she said quietly. What? The others exchanged looks, uneasy. Then from somewhere deep in the woods came a sound, a low, hollow cry, not quite human, not quite animal. It rolled through the trees like a voice made of wind and grief. Hank reached for his rifle. Mountain cats don't sound like that. Clara straightened, her face pale but calm. That's not a cat. That's something else. Ethan swallowed hard. You're saying, what, a ghost? Clara turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Not all ghosts are dead. The sound came again, closer this time. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Clara motioned for them to move quietly. They followed the noise, step by careful step, until they reached the mouth of a collapsed mine, half buried in snow and stone. Wade's rifle, Hank said, pointing. It lay just inside the entrance. Clara crouched beside it, examining the ground. 2 sets of tracks lead in, she said softly. Only one comes out, Ethan's heart hammered. So he's still in there. Clara met his eyes. Maybe. Without hesitation, she ducked into the mine. The others followed, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dark. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and rust. The tunnel sloped downward, walls slick with ice. Ethan's boots slipped more than once, and Hank had to catch him. Clara moved steadily ahead, her light sweeping over the walls. Then she stopped. A faint mark had been scratched into the ice, 3 lines crossing a fourth. A hunting symbol. Wade's sign. He's alive, Hank whispered. Clara nodded once. He left a trail. They followed the symbols deeper into the dark. Each one led to the next. Some carved into wood, others etched in frost. Finally, they reached a cavern where the air felt strangely warm. At the center lay a pile of old mining debris, and beneath it a boot. Wade! Hank shouted, rushing forward. They dug fast, pulling away the stones and boards. Beneath them, Wade Kavanaugh lay unconscious but breathing. His leg was pinned beneath a beam. Clara dropped to her knees, checked his pulse, and exhaled. He's alive? We need to move him before this place collapses. Ethan helped where he could, adrenaline numbing his fear. Together, they pried the beam loose and hauled Wade free. As they lifted him, a deep rumble shook the walls. Snow and stone cascaded from above. Go! Hank barked. They ran, the tunnel collapsing behind them, the mountain roaring like it meant to bury them all. Clara led the way, her movements swift and sure even in the chaos. They burst into daylight just as the mine caved in completely, sealing the entrance in a cloud of white dust and snow. For a long moment no one spoke. Only their ragged breathing filled the silence. Then Wade stirred, coughing weakly.
Clara?
She knelt beside him, smiling faintly. You're safe now. He gripped her hand. I saw her. Clara's smile faded. Who? The little girl, Wade rasped. She was in the tunnel. She showed me the way out. Everyone froze. Clara's hand trembled. What did you say? She looked like you, Wade whispered. Same eyes. Said, tell Mama I'm still here. The color drained from Clara's face. She stood slowly, turning toward the mountain. The wind picked up again, carrying a low hum through the trees. Hank touched her shoulder gently. Clara, she's been trying to tell me, Clara murmured, eyes wide and distant. All these years I thought I buried her, but the mountain kept her. Ethan felt the air shift around them, heavy with something ancient, something that wasn't done yet. Clara looked back at the others. Get him home, she said softly. I have to go back. Hank shook his head. You can't go in there again, it's unstable. But she was already walking toward the ridge, her figure fading into the snow. Ethan took a step forward. We can't just let her go. Hank caught his arm. She's not lost, he said quietly. She's going where she belongs. Ethan stared after her until she disappeared completely. Swallowed by the white, he would later write that the wind on Boone Ridge didn't sound like wind at all, that sometimes, if you listened close, you could hear it whisper a name, Clara, or maybe Mama. When spring came, the snow melted from the ridge. The river ran clear again. No one saw Clara Boone after that day, but one morning, Hank Larson found something outside his office door, a wooden carving of a young girl, newly made, set neatly beside a sprig of mountain laurel. He smiled sadly, brushed snow from its face, and set it on his desk. The mountain remembers, he said quietly, and in the distance, the wind sighed through the pines like a mother's voice calling her child home. By dawn, the storm had finally broken. The air over the ridge smelled of pine and smoke and something metallic, like the aftertaste of fear. Ethan crouched beside the smoldering remains of the campfire, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The valley below was painted silver by the first light of day. For a moment everything looked calm, but the mountain, Clara once told him, had a way of pretending. He turned at the sound of boots crunching in the snow. Clara came out of the trees, rifle slung over her shoulder, her coat rimed with frost. Her eyes were red-rimmed from the cold, but steady. Always steady. You slept at all? She asked. Didn't feel like it. Ethan stood, watching her as she checked the rifle's bolt. You were gone all night. I figured you'd come back dragging another body. She didn't answer right away. She just knelt, stirring the fire's ashes with a stick. "There's a trail," she said finally. "Blood, small tracks. The kind a scared kid makes when he's running and doesn't know where to go." Ethan frowned. "You think Caleb's still alive?" She looked up, her eyes sharp. "I don't think, I know. He's moving downhill. Toward the ravine." That meant toward the worst of the terrain. Jagged rocks, hidden pits, thin ice sheets over fast water. If the boy had gone that way, he was either desperate or delirious. Ethan packed up the rest of their gear while Clara scouted the tree line. The other hunters were supposed to meet them by sunrise, but the storm had knocked out radios and washed the trail clean. They were on their own again, just the two of them, like the start of this whole damn thing. When they set off, Clara walked ahead in silence. Her steps were sure even on the ice. Ethan followed, watching her every move. There was something about her, something that didn't fit with the gossip he'd heard at the tavern months ago. "Best tracker in Montana," the old men had said, laughing. "But don't cross her. She's half wild herself. The mountain took something from her once, and she's been hunting it ever since." He hadn't believed them. Not until now. They reached the ravine before noon. The wind had died down, but the cold had teeth again, gnawing through gloves and coats. Clara crouched by a set of tracks near a fallen pine. "Here," she whispered. He stopped here. "See how the snow's disturbed?" He fell. "Maybe slept." Ethan knelt beside her. "And the blood?" "Dried. From his left hand, maybe. Small wound. Not fatal." She stood and scanned the ridge beyond. He was scared. Running from something? From the storm? She shook her head. "Storms don't chase kids, Ethan." Before he could ask what she meant, a sound split the quiet. A single distant crack, sharp and hollow. A gunshot. They froze. Then Clara moved. "That came from the ridge," she said, already walking. "Could be a hunter," Ethan offered, but she didn't respond. Her pace quickened. Ethan followed, heart pounding against the cold. The ridge loomed high, its edge lined with black pines and sheer drops. When they reached the top, Clara stopped so suddenly that Ethan nearly ran into her. Down below, near the frozen creek, lay a man, motionless, his orange vest stark against the snow. "God," Ethan breathed. "Who is that?" Clara raised her binoculars. The lenses caught the pale light. Her jaw tightened. "John Laird," she said. Ethan blinked. "The sheriff, deputy. He went missing 2 days before the storm." They scrambled down the slope, boots sliding on loose shale and ice. When they reached the body, Clara went to one knee. The snow around Laird was dark with blood. The shot had gone clean through his chest. Ethan crouched beside her. "He's been here a while," he said, voice low. "This isn't from today." Clara didn't answer. She was staring at something half buried in the snow. A small leather satchel, its strap snapped. She pulled it free, brushing off the frost. Inside were maps, a revolver, and a torn photograph. It showed a boy, maybe 10, blonde, smiling. Caleb Ethan's stomach tightened. He was looking for the kid too. Not exactly. Clara turned the photo over. On the back, scrawled in a hurried hand, were the words, "She's not who you think." Ethan looked up at her. "What the hell does that mean?" Clara didn't answer. She stood and scanned the trees. "We keep moving," she said. "The boy's close." He caught her arm. "Clara, you knew him, didn't you?" Her eyes flicked to his hand, then to his face. "You think you want the truth," she said quietly. "You don't." She pulled free and walked on. By mid-afternoon they found the boy. He was curled inside a hollow beneath a fallen cedar, wrapped in a torn blanket. His lips were blue, but his chest rose and fell shallowly. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, brushing snow from his hair. "Caleb," she whispered. Ethan knelt opposite her, heart pounding. "He's alive, barely." She pressed her ear to the boy's chest. "We have to get him to the outpost before nightfall." Ethan looked around. "That's 10 miles through broken terrain." "We'll never—" Clara shot him a look that shut him up. "And help me." They wrapped the boy in every bit of spare cloth and lifted him between them. Each step was agony. The snow was knee-deep, the air thin. Clara led the way, marking the safest path through the drifts. Ethan followed, feeling the boy's weak pulse against his shoulder. For hours they trudged in silence, until the trees thinned and the sky turned bruised purple. Then, without warning, Clara stopped. A shape moved ahead in the fog. Ethan squinted. Another hunter? The figure stepped forward, rifle raised. "Drop the boy," a voice called. "Now," Clara froze. "Lad?" she said softly. The man didn't answer. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, a ghost of the deputy they'd found dead. Ethan's throat went dry. "That's not possible." The man smiled, a twisted thing. "Not unless you believe the mountain gives back what it takes." Clara's hand went to her sidearm. "You're not real." "Maybe not," the figure said, "but neither are the things you've buried." Then the sound of the river cut through the silence, a roar of thawing ice and rushing water. Clara's grip faltered. Ethan blinked, and the man was gone. The forest was empty again. Only the wind remained. "Clara?" Ethan whispered. "What did you see?" She didn't speak. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused. "Clara!" She blinked hard, then shook her head. "We keep moving." They reached the outpost just before nightfall, a ranger station half buried under snow. Inside, the fireplace was dead, but the walls still held the heat of old smoke. They laid Caleb near the hearth and covered him with blankets. When Ethan turned, he found Clara staring at the door, rifle still in hand. "You saw him too," she said quietly. "Didn't you?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know what I saw," she smiled faintly. "That's what everyone says the first time." He frowned. "The first time what?" "When the mountain remembers you." She sat, finally, by the fireless hearth, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. "I used to live here," she said, "before the accident. My husband was a ranger. Our son—" She paused. "He went missing in a storm like this one." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Caleb reminds you of him," she nodded. "Same eyes. Same way of running when he's scared. I searched these woods for weeks. Found nothing. But sometimes after dark I'd hear him. His voice calling from the ridge." She looked up at him, eyes glinting in the firelight. "That's why they call me the best tracker. Because I never stopped looking. Even when the mountain started showing me ghosts." Ethan swallowed hard. "You think that's what we saw out there? A ghost?" Clara's expression didn't change. "I think this place doesn't like to let go. And maybe it wants a trade." As if on cue, Caleb stirred. He let out a weak moan, eyes fluttering open. Clara leaned forward. "Hey," she whispered. "You're safe now." The boy's gaze moved past her, unfocused. Then he spoke, voice thin but clear. He said he was waiting for you. Clara froze. "Who?" The boy's lips trembled. "The man by the river." Ethan felt the air grow colder. Clara stood, her face unreadable. "Get some rest," she said. "We leave at first light." She walked to the window and stared out at the snow. Outside, the trees swayed like dark sentinels, whispering secrets through the wind. Ethan sat beside the boy, but his thoughts were on her, the woman everyone had mocked, the one they'd called half-wild. He understood now. She wasn't chasing lost children. She was chasing her past. And maybe, he thought, the mountain wasn't done with her yet. The wind returned that night, not howling, not screaming, but whispering. It moved through the cracks in the cabin walls like a breath too close to the ear. Ethan sat awake by the cold hearth, staring at the rifle propped beside the door. Clara hadn't moved in hours. She stood by the window, eyes fixed on the line of pines swaying beneath the moonlight. Caleb slept fitfully, murmuring words no one could make out. Sometimes his hand twitched, as if reaching for something in a dream. "You should rest," Ethan said quietly. Clara didn't answer. He rose and walked over. "You've been standing there since sundown. What are you expecting to see?" Her voice came out like gravel. "You still don't get it, do you? This place isn't about what you see. It's about what you remember." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" She finally turned toward him, eyes sharp with exhaustion. "You said it yourself. The mountain doesn't make sense. People vanish, then it spits them back out. Sometimes they're alive, sometimes they're not. But every time it happens, it wants something in return." He folded his arms. "You really believe that?" She gave a faint, humorless smile. "I used to think I was just cursed with bad luck. Then I learned luck doesn't keep whispering your son's name after 10 years. Before Ethan could respond, Caleb stirred again, this time with a sharp cry. Clara rushed to his side, kneeling beside the boy. Hey, easy, she murmured. You're safe. Caleb's eyes were open now, wide and terrified. He's out there, he whispered. The man with the broken badge, he said you have to come. Ethan's blood went cold. The deputy? Clara's hand trembled as she brushed the boy's hair from his forehead. Where, Caleb? Where did you see him? The boy pointed toward the dark window. By the river. Ethan shook his head. That's impossible. The river's frozen, but Clara was already grabbing her rifle. Clara, he's leading me somewhere, she said. Maybe to my boy. Maybe to the truth, or maybe to your death, Ethan snapped. She slung the rifle over her shoulder. Doesn't make much difference, does it? Ethan cursed under his breath and followed her out the door. The night was alive with quiet. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the forest loomed like a cathedral of black spires. The moon hung low, veiled by thin clouds. Clara moved with purpose, her lantern swaying in her hand. Ethan followed a few steps behind, scanning the tree line for any movement. When they reached the river, the ice gleamed silver under the moonlight. Mist curled up from cracks where the water still flowed beneath. Clara knelt at the edge, brushing aside the snow. There, she whispered. Ethan leaned closer. Faint boot prints led from the trees down to the water's edge, large, heavy, and recent. Could be from when we were here before, he said. Clara shook her head. No, these are fresh. Someone or something was here after dark. A sound broke the silence. A single, sharp whistle carried through the trees. Ethan froze. He began, then stopped. Clara's eyes went wide. That's the call my husband used when we hunted together. The whistle came again, closer this time. Ethan raised his rifle, heart hammering. We need to get back to the cabin. Clara didn't move. You can go, she said softly. But I'm not leaving. Clara, she stepped onto the frozen river before he could stop her. The ice groaned beneath her boots. Clara, stop! Ethan shouted. She didn't. She walked to the center of the river where the mist was thickest, and then she froze. Ethan saw it too, a shape standing across the river. A man, tall, wearing a ranger's coat and holding a lantern that flickered like dying fire. David, she breathed. The figure lifted the lantern higher. For a moment his face was visible, pale, half-rotted yet unmistakable. Her husband, Ethan, shouted again, but the wind swallowed his words. Clara dropped to her knees on the ice. Where's our boy? She cried. The figure didn't answer. It only pointed toward the trees behind her, and then it was gone. The ice cracked beneath her. Ethan sprinted forward, grabbing her arm as the surface splintered. The river roared beneath, dark and hungry. With a grunt, he hauled her back to solid ground. Just as the ice gave way completely, they collapsed in the snow, gasping. He pointed to the ridge. Clara whispered, That's where it ends. Ethan grabbed her shoulders. You nearly died. Her eyes were wild. He showed me where my son is. He shook his head. You don't know that. You're seeing ghosts, Clara. She pushed him away. Maybe, but ghosts don't leave tracks. She stood and started toward the ridge. Ethan hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty, then cursed and followed. By the time they reached the ridge, the sky was bleeding gray with dawn. The wind had gone still. At the top, the snow gave way to frozen earth, and a single tree stood alone, twisted, bare, and half buried in frost. Clara stopped beneath it, staring at the ground. Then she dropped to her knees and brushed away the snow. Beneath the surface was a small wooden cross, weathered, forgotten. Ethan's breath caught. You buried him here, Clara nodded slowly. I told myself I never found him, that he was still out there, lost. It was easier than admitting I'd already said goodbye. She ran a trembling hand over the wood. The mountain didn't take my boy. It took my memory of him. That's the curse. Ethan knelt beside her. And the deputy? The visions? She gave a small, broken smile. Just the mountain's way of making sure I remembered what I'd buried. The first light of morning crept over the ridge, turning the frost to gold. Clara closed her eyes, whispering something too soft for Ethan to hear. Then she stood, shoulders straight, eyes clear for the first time since he'd met her. It's done, she said. The mountain got what it wanted, Ethan frowned. What's that? She looked back toward the valley, toward the cabin where the boy still slept. "Forgiveness," she said, "and someone left to carry the story." She started walking down the ridge. Ethan followed, the wind at their backs. Behind them, the mountain stood silent again. But somewhere in the distance, faint as a memory, a child's laughter drifted through the trees. By the time Ethan and Clara descended Boone Ridge, the storm had broken. The snow fell lightly now, soft as ash, blurring the valley into shades of grey and silver. Behind them, the first light of morning turned the clouds rose gold, a color that didn't belong to death or sorrow, but something like peace. They reached the cabin just as Caleb stirred awake. He sat up, blinking in confusion, as if waking from a long dream. When he saw Clara and Ethan step through the door, his eyes went wide. "Did you find him?" he whispered. Clara paused. Her hands trembled against the doorframe. For a moment Ethan thought she might lie, but she only knelt beside the boy and said softly, "He's home now, sweetheart. Not lost anymore." Caleb didn't fully understand. Maybe he never would, but he nodded. "The mountain's quiet now," he said. Ethan glanced toward the window. The wind had gone still. Even the trees looked calmer, like sentinels finally at rest. They spent the morning in silence, packing what little they had. By noon, the snow had melted just enough to make the roads passable. Clara saddled up the truck she hadn't driven in years, its paint scabbed with rust and memory. "You're really leaving?" Ethan asked as they loaded the last of the gear. Clara adjusted the strap of her pack. "Boone Ridge kept me too long. My son's resting. I've got nothing left here but ghosts." Ethan hesitated. "And where will you go?" She gave a faint smile. "Maybe somewhere without mountains." He nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket and pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd filled with half-sarcastic notes about coffee and small-town silence. He flipped it open and tore out a page. "Then take this," he said. "My editor's number. If you ever want your story told, the real one, I'll make sure it's done right." Clara looked at the slip of paper like it was something fragile. "Maybe someday," she murmured. "But not yet." She climbed into the driver's seat, started the old engine, and gave one last glance at the ridge towering in the distance. For a heartbeat, her expression softened. Grief, love, and release all tangled in her eyes. Then she drove off, the truck disappearing into the pale horizon. Ethan stood there until she vanished completely. Then he turned back toward town, with Caleb by his side. Boone Ridge met them in wary silence. When Hank Larson saw the boy alive, he exhaled so deeply it sounded like a prayer. Lauren ran from the store, tears freezing on her cheeks as she pulled Caleb into her arms. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't reach for his notebook. He just watched. Hank stepped up beside him. "You found her, didn't you?" Ethan nodded. "She found him. And something else." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You see anything up there?" Ethan thought of the cracked ice, the lantern flickering across the river, the face that wasn't supposed to be there. He thought of the small cross beneath the tree, and Clara's voice whispering forgiveness into the wind. He met Hank's gaze. "Just snow," he said quietly, "and a woman who finally stopped running." Hank studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "That's enough." Lauren led her son away, murmuring thanks through her tears. Ethan stood alone on the edge of Main Street, feeling the weight of everything he'd seen and everything he still didn't understand. 2 weeks later, his article went live. It wasn't what his editor expected. No talk of ghosts, no mention of the dead rising, no sensational title. Just a piece called "The Mountain Woman of Boone Ridge." He wrote about grief, about places that refuse to let go, and about people who become part of the landscape when their hearts break deep enough. He ended it simply. "The mountain doesn't take. It keeps. What we lose, it remembers. What we bury, it holds until we're ready to face it." The piece spread quietly online, shared, debated, doubted. Boone Ridge, for a few weeks, became a name whispered on podcasts and blogs. Some said Ethan made it up. Others swore they'd seen a woman matching Clara's description, walking along back roads in Wyoming, always heading south, always just out of reach. Ethan never confirmed or denied anything. He returned to Chicago in spring. But sometimes, when the wind came down hard between the buildings, carrying that same cold whisper, he'd glance north, toward Montana, and wonder if the mountains still remembered him too. Years later, a hiker found an old wooden cross half buried in the snow above Boone Ridge. There were no names carved on it. No markers, just a single word burned faintly into the wood: forgiven. 5 years later, the wind still howled over Boone Ridge, softer now, but still carrying the voices of the past. The town had changed little. The diner had a new coat of paint, the post office finally shut for good, and the general store still smelled of pine cleaner and old tobacco. Ethan Ward's article had come and gone like a snow squall, leaving ripples but no waves. Still, among the locals, it lingered in low conversation, like something half-believed. That morning, a young woman stepped out of a rental jeep and stood at the edge of Main Street. Her name was Grace Ward. She looked up at the ridge, the same ridge her father had once written about, the one he could never quite forget. In his final years, before cancer took him, Ethan had spoken of it often, how the mountain wasn't cruel, just honest. How it forced you to face yourself. Grace carried his old leather notebook, its pages warped from time and weather. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. If the mountain ever calls you, don't go to find ghosts. Go to understand them. She followed the path leading north, the one Hank Larson had once warned Ethan not to take alone. The trail was faint now, swallowed by pines and drifts of snow. As she climbed, the air grew sharper, cleaner, almost reverent. Halfway up the ridge she found it, the wooden cross nearly buried. The word forgiven still faintly marked across the grain. Someone had tied a single white feather to it. Grace knelt in the snow. She didn't speak, but she laid her hand against the wood, closing her eyes. A crow called overhead, sharp and distant. When she looked up, she thought, for just an instant, she saw movement higher on the ridge. A figure wrapped in furs, standing against the light, watching. Grace blinked and it was gone. Only the wind moved now, whispering through the trees. She smiled, tears stinging her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the ghost of her father or the mountain woman, but to the place itself. Then she turned and began her descent. Behind her, the wind carried faint echoes, not sorrow, not warning, but something gentler. The sound of a mountain breathing in peace. And as Grace reached the tree line, she could have sworn she heard a voice, low, steady, and almost proud, murmuring through the snow, "The ridge remembers." Spring came late to Boone Ridge, as it always did. The snow melted in stubborn patches, leaving behind veins of mud and the smell of thawing pine. The river roared louder than usual, a sign, the locals said, that the mountains were restless again. Sheriff Hank Larson sat on the bench outside the diner, hat tipped low against the morning glare. His hands were rougher, his hair more gray than silver now. 5 years had passed since that storm, since Clara Boone and Ethan Ward went into the mountains, and only one came back. Lauren Grayson joined him with 2 coffees, setting one beside him. "Still keeping watch?" she asked softly. He gave a dry laugh. "Some habits die harder than old sheriffs." Lauren looked up at the ridge where the tree line cut into the clouds. "You ever think about going back up there?" "Every damn day," Hank said. "Then I remember she told me not to." Lauren smiled faintly. "Clara always got her way." Hank nodded. "Even when she didn't mean to." Across the road, a young woman exited the general store, Grace Ward. Her eyes caught the mountain the same way Ethan's once had, with a mix of awe and fear, as if it might speak. Hank watched her pause at the end of the street, the leather notebook clutched against her chest. "She's his kid?" Lauren asked. "Yeah," Hank said. "Got his stubborn look, too." Grace crossed the road toward them. "Sheriff Larson?" He stood, tipping his hat. "Haven't been sheriff in years, ma'am. Just Hank now," she smiled gently. "My father mentioned you. Said you were the last man to see him alive." Hank's throat tightened. "He was one of the bravest fools I ever met." Grace nodded, her expression steady but sad. "He used to tell me the mountain doesn't take, it keeps. That if you listen close enough, it'll tell you what it's holding." Hank looked toward the distant ridge, where the clouds gathered low and slow, like memory itself. He wasn't wrong, Grace hesitated. I'd like to go up there. To leave something, Lauren's hand brushed her arm. Then go when the light's still good. And if you hear her, don't be afraid. Grace frowned slightly. Her? Hank's gaze never left the ridge. The mountain woman, he said quietly. She still walks those woods. Folks don't see her much, but sometimes, when the wind hits just right, you can hear her humming, like she's guiding someone home. The three stood in silence for a while, listening. The river, the wind, the whisper of pine needles. Somewhere far above, a hawk cried out, a single clear note that carried through the valley. Grace looked up at the ridge once more, the shadow of a smile on her lips. Then maybe I'll go find her. Hank nodded slowly. No, Miss Ward, he said. If you're meant to, she'll find you. The wind shifted. The ridge exhaled, and Boone Ridge, for the first time in years, felt alive again. A morning mist hung low over Boone Ridge, curling through the trees like ghost breath. Grace Ward tightened her coat, her boots crunching through old frost as she began the climb. The mountain loomed above her, quiet and watchful, a cathedral of stone and pine where every sound seemed to echo twice. She carried little, her father's leather journal, a tin flask of water, and a locket containing a faded photograph of him. In it, Ethan Ward was smiling beside a woman she'd never met, Clara Boone, the mountain woman. Grace had heard the name whispered in diners, murmured in the general store, always with a mix of respect and fear. Some said Clara had become part of the land after the storm. Others said she'd simply vanished, taken by the same wilderness she once mastered. Grace didn't believe in ghost stories, but she believed in echoes. The trail narrowed, forcing her through brambles and roots that clung like memory. Each step brought fragments of sound, a snapping branch, a bird's distant cry, the soft rush of the river below. She followed the ridgeline higher, past the fallen trees and the ruins of a hunting cabin half swallowed by moss. The air grew colder, and then she saw it, a clearing. Small, circular, ringed by stones and tall pines bending inward as though in reverence. At its center stood a crude wooden marker, weathered by decades of snow and sun. It wasn't much, just 2 planks lashed together with twine, but at its base were wildflowers. Fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. Grace knelt. Her fingers brushed the name etched faintly into the wood. Clara Boone. The wind moved through the trees like a sigh. She set her father's journal at the base of the marker and opened it. The final entry was dated 3 days before his death. Clara's still out there. The others don't believe me, but I've heard her voice in the wind, calling not for help, but for peace. If I find her, maybe I'll finally understand why she stayed when everyone else left. Grace swallowed hard, tracing the ink with trembling fingers. If this is the last trail I walk, I hope someone remembers what she did for me, Grace whispered. I remember. Dad, the forest answered with silence. Then came a faint rustle, soft, deliberate. Grace turned. A shadow shifted between the trees. Her pulse quickened. Hello? She called. No answer. She rose slowly, eyes scanning the pines. If you're there, I'm not here to take anything. I just wanted to see where he... A low creak interrupted her, like a door swinging on old hinges. She followed the sound around a thicket and froze. There, half hidden by the slope, stood a small cabin. The door was ajar. Grace approached cautiously, her boots sinking into damp soil. Inside, dust danced in a beam of pale light. The air smelled of cedar and thyme. There were jars on the shelves, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a wood stove long gone cold, and on the table, a map of Boone Ridge, hand-drawn in charcoal, covered with notes. Trails, ridges, streams, words scrawled in a sharp feminine hand. They don't understand the mountain. It keeps what it loves. Grace touched the edge of the paper. Her breath trembled. Then she noticed another object, a small leather pouch beside the map. Inside was a silver compass, its glass cracked, its needle still quivering. She recognized it immediately, her father's compass. He'd carried it every day of his life. Grace's eyes stung. You found him, didn't you? She whispered. You brought him home." The wind outside rose suddenly, pushing through the door and stirring the papers. One page fluttered free, landing at her feet. It wasn't a map. It was a letter. "To whoever finds this place, I never meant to be a legend. I just did what the mountain taught me. To listen, to move when it moves, to protect what's still wild." Ethan was brave. Too brave. The storm took him, but it didn't take his spirit. He's part of this ridge now. Maybe I am too. If you've come this far, leave your fear behind. The mountain remembers the kind ones. Clara Boone Grace folded the letter carefully, her heart aching with both grief and wonder. She stepped outside, the air suddenly lighter, cleaner. The mist had lifted, revealing a view that stretched for miles. The valley, the river, the distant town of Boone Ridge, glinting like a forgotten memory. She knelt once more by the wooden marker, placing the compass atop it. "For both of you," she said softly. "May you keep each other company." The forest was quiet again, but not empty. As she turned to leave, a faint sound reached her ears, a low, steady humming, almost like a lullaby carried by the wind. It was old, soothing, and hauntingly human. Grace stopped. The melody seemed to come from everywhere at once. The trees, the stones, the sky. Her lips parted in a quiet smile. "I hear you," she whispered. Then she began the walk back down the mountain, the tune fading gently behind her. By the time she reached the valley, the clouds had cleared completely. Boone Ridge stood bright under the sun, and for the first time in years, the wind carried no sorrow, only song. Epilogue. The Tracker's Legacy. Months later, hikers began leaving offerings at the ridge clearing, feathers, coins, and handwritten notes. Some swore that when storms came, the wind guided them to safety. Others claimed to see a woman's figure at the tree line, tall, calm, eyes like the earth after rain. The locals didn't call her Clara Boone anymore. They just called her the Guardian of the Ridge. And somewhere, deep within the mountain's heart, the wind laughed, soft, warm, and alive. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot. The hills of Pine Hollow were quiet that morning, but the silence was not peaceful. Smoke still lingered from the remnants of the storm the night before, curling low over the trees like a wounded serpent. Birds circled cautiously above, and the wind carried the faint tang of ash and wet earth down into the valley. Ellie Walker stood at the edge of her cabin's clearing, surveying the scene, her hands still dirt-stained from tending the salvaged wagon axle and repairing splintered boards. Jonah Miller knelt beside the wheel, fitting a freshly forged iron rim, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Grace Barrett hovered nearby, clutching a small notebook where she'd written down the details of her father's ledger, every stolen coin, every falsified record. Dr. Henry Cole was seated under the partial shelter of the collapsed shed, carefully, washing and dressing the minor burns on Ellie's forearms. The air was tense, charged not with anger but with anticipation. The day ahead would demand courage from all of them, and for Ellie it would demand everything she had left. The wagon, patched and reinforced, now gleamed with a sturdy beauty, a blend of old wood, polished by Ellie's careful hands, and new iron shining in the soft sunlight. It was no longer a relic of sorrow, it was a statement, a promise that Pine Hollow could not simply bury the truth under fear and tradition. "Ready, Ellie?" Jonah asked quietly, pausing his hammering to glance up. There was more than curiosity in his gaze. There was hope. Ellie nodded, gripping the reins of Daisy, whose ears twitched at every distant sound. "We ride today. No more hiding." Her voice carried an unshakable authority, the kind forged through years of solitude, grief, and relentless work. "We show them what's been done behind closed doors." The small procession moved slowly through the muddy trail leading to the village. Grace walked beside Ellie, her notebook tucked safely under her arm, her eyes scanning the trees and rooftops for signs of early watchers. Jonah followed with a sack of supplies and a repaired iron tool, and Dr. Cole brought up the rear, carrying a bundle of herbs, his brow furrowed with worry but determination. As the wagon crested the ridge overlooking Pine Hollow, they could see the town beginning to stir. Women were hanging laundry, unaware yet of the unfolding drama. Men leaned from porch railings, squinting against the sun, still whispering about the previous night's chaos. The church bell tolled in the distance, an ironic prelude to the events about to unfold. Ellie breathed deeply, letting the mountain air fill her lungs. "We'll start at the square," she said, nodding toward the central gathering of the town. "We'll speak, we'll show them the proof. But we do it clean, no lies, no shouting. Truth speaks loud enough." Grace glanced up at her, admiration shining in her young eyes. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than Ellie had expected. "Whatever happens, I'll be right there." The wagon rumbled down the trail, Daisy's hooves sinking slightly in the damp earth. Villagers began to notice, heads turning, mouths opening in whispered shock. Ellie's wagon, once the object of ridicule, now carried the tools of revelation. Jars of herbs, meticulously labeled, ledger pages Grace had copied, even the iron plate with the initials CB carefully displayed for all to see. Martha Jenkins was the first to recognize them, her apron still dusted with flour from morning bread. Her eyes widened, a mix of fear and awe, as she stumbled toward the edge of the square. "Ellie Walker," she hissed, clutching her shawl tightly. "What in God's name?" Ellie held her gaze, calm and unwavering. "Martha," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "You know why I'm here. The town deserves to know the truth, about the fire, about the stolen iron, about the lies that have been fed to you for too long." The murmurs grew louder. Townsfolk exchanged glances, some skeptical, others curious. Clyde Barrett appeared at the far end of the square, his boots crunching on the cobblestones. He had arrived after the first stirrings of the crowd, his face tight with anger, his eyes scanning Ellie like a hawk ready to strike. "Ellie Walker," he called, voice carrying over the square. "What foolishness is this? Do you intend to turn the good people of Pine Hollow against their own, against me?" Ellie leaned slightly forward from the wagon. "Sheriff Barrett," she said, keeping her tone steady, "I intend to show them the truth. You've used fear and faith to hide what you did. It's time the town knows who is responsible for Thomas Walker's death." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Whispers became gasps. Some faces paled, others hardened with disbelief. Clyde's lips curled into a forced smile, but his eyes darted nervously toward Grace, who stood slightly behind Ellie, holding the copied ledger in trembling hands. "Enough!" Clyde barked, attempting to regain control. "You're a woman gone mad with grief, letting old wounds fester. You accuse me without proof." Ellie lifted her hand, signaling calm. "Proof," she said, pointing to the ledger Grace held aloft, "and witness testimony, and the iron plate marked with your initials from the very bridge project you embezzled. The truth is in their hands now, Sheriff." Grace stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and fearless. "These are the records. Every misused coin, every falsified document. You've lied to us for years." She turned to the crowd. "We can't let fear rule Pine Hollow any longer." A stunned silence followed. People shuffled, murmuring to one another. Some cast quick, fearful glances toward Clyde, who was now pacing, fists clenched, veins visible in his neck. His mask of authority was cracking. Jonah stepped up beside Ellie, placing a firm hand on the wagon for support. "She speaks the truth. We've had enough of lies." His voice carried the weight of years of loyalty and heartbreak. "It's time someone stood up to corruption." Dr. Cole cleared his throat, stepping forward, his calm presence amplifying the gravity of the moment. "The records are accurate. The iron was stolen, and the fire that claimed Thomas Walker was not divine will. It was deliberate. I can confirm it from my own knowledge of the construction contracts. Murmurs escalated into voices, voices into shouts. Some villagers began nodding, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Martha Jenkins, after a long pause, stepped forward, voice trembling. If this is true, then we've been blind." Her hands shook as she gestured to her apron, the flour dust catching in the morning sun. "I've been wrong about her. About you, Ellie." Ellie's lips pressed together, holding back the flood of emotion. This was the moment of reckoning, not just for Clyde Barrett, but for the town itself. The wagon, once broken and scorned, now stood as a symbol of resilience, of truth, of rebirth. Clyde's face contorted with rage, his voice rising to a near shout. "You'll regret this! You think a woman's words and a few papers will topple the law of Pine Hollow?" Jonah's grip on the wagon tightened. "Law? Law is protecting the guilty, Sheriff. We're giving the town its right back." Grace met her father's eyes directly, unwavering. "You've ruled with fear for too long. Pine Hollow deserves better. We deserve justice." The townsfolk, seeing Ellie, Grace, Jonah, and Dr. A. Cole united, began murmuring among themselves. Courage spread like fire through dry brush. Some stepped closer to Ellie, tentative but hopeful, while others crossed their arms, skeptical, but unable to ignore the mounting proof and the sheer determination of the small group. Clyde Barrett's composure finally snapped. He stormed toward Ellie, fists raised, but a hand on his shoulder stopped him. It was Dr. Cole, firm and steady. "Violence won't restore your honor, Sheriff. Only truth can do that." The sheriff staggered, uncertainty flashing across his face. Around him, the once muted town had transformed into a community demanding justice. The balance of power had shifted, and Clyde realized that the years of fear he had cultivated were collapsing. Ellie lowered her gaze briefly to Daisy, then back at the town. "We rebuild," she said quietly, her voice carrying to the furthest edges of the square. "We heal, not just the wagon, not just our homes, but the heart of Pine Hollow itself." And in that moment, the mountains seemed to breathe with her, the wind carrying away years of deceit and whispering a promise of renewal. The wagon creaked as Daisy shifted her weight, ready for the journeys ahead. The lessons learned, the truth unveiled, and the courage found in secrecy and solitude would now guide Pine Hollow toward a future defined not by fear, but by hope. The people of Pine Hollow would never forget the day a widow and her broken wagon became the catalyst for their awakening. Sarah didn't answer at first. She just stared at the photo, her reflection faintly visible in the glass over the child's face. "All these years," she murmured. "He stayed here alone, just to protect the truth. To make sure no one else got hurt." Danny sighed, looking toward the burned chapel. "My grandmother always said the mountain had a heartbeat, that it keeps the memories of those who died here. Maybe he was part of that." The drizzle thickened into rain. It pattered softly on the ruins, hissing against the dying embers. Sheriff Cole approached, his face lined with fatigue. "Miss Carter, we'll need your statement one more time before we wrap up for the day." Sarah nodded faintly. "Of course." Cole paused before walking off again. "You did something good here. Might not feel like it yet, but some stories deserve to end in daylight." When he left, Sarah looked around the village one last time. The blackened beams, the ghost outlines of cabins, the way the fog swallowed the treetops. She had come here to rebuild her life, to escape fire, not walk back into it. And yet, in some twisted way, the mountain had given her what she needed most, closure. She rose to her feet. "Come on, Hunter." The dog trotted beside her as she walked down the muddy trail toward her cabin. The rain washed over the path, softening the footprints that led back to the chapel, erasing the final traces of the night before. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp pine and old smoke. Sarah set the locket on the table beside the burned photograph she'd saved. Two ghosts, side by side, one who'd been lost to fire and one who'd been saved by it. Danny lingered in the doorway. "You sure you're staying?" Sarah smiled faintly. For a while. Someone has to finish what I started, rebuild the village, make it livable again. Not as a monument to tragedy, but as something new. He nodded, admiration flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. You're braver than I'd be, maybe, she said softly. Or maybe I just learned what fire can't take from you. Hunter barked once, tail wagging weakly. Danny gave a small smile. If you need help, you know where to find me. When he left, Sarah sat by the window watching the fog roll through the trees. The rain had already begun to fade, replaced by shafts of pale sunlight cutting through the clouds. She felt for the first time in years a strange peace settle over her chest. The mountain was quiet again, but not empty. She picked up her journal and began to write, not a diary like the one she'd found, but something new, the story of a burned village, a grieving woman, and the truth that refused to stay buried. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. For a moment, she thought she heard a child's laughter, faint, distant, like an echo carried on the rain. Sarah looked up, smiling through her tears. Rest now, she whispered. You're home. Hunter lifted his head and let out a small whine, as if agreeing. And for the first time since she'd arrived on the mountain, Evelyn Carter felt something she hadn't in years. Not fear, not grief, but belonging. The fire had taken much, but it had also revealed what was left behind. Ashes, truth, and a reason to start again. The sun slipped behind the Blue Ridge peaks as Evelyn stood beside the rebuilt church, Ranger resting quietly at her feet. The once abandoned village now whispered with life, flowers growing where graves had been, laughter echoing faintly through repaired walls. She looked toward the spot where Ranger had first dug and whispered, We brought them home. A soft wind carried the church bell's faint chime through the valley. For the first time in years, Briar Hollow wasn't haunted. It was finally at peace. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.